In those years, when Germany was just beginning to recover from the war, the ruins were still smoking, and the smell of burning and rust was absorbed into the air as firmly as into the walls of destroyed buildings. On the outskirts of Leipzig, among wastelands and drafts, stood an old textile factory. Her grey silhouette could be seen from afar, like a ghost of the past, stubbornly unwilling to disappear. Her windows were broken, the workshops were empty, and only the wind howled through the cracks in the walls, reminding her that life once boiled inside. In early 1949, construction workers came there, ordinary workers hired to dismantle old structures. The state needed bricks, metal, and anything that could be reused. None of them suspected that under the concrete slabs there was not just a forgotten warehouse, but something that would change them all. Work began at dawn. The old-fashioned excavator hummed with effort, scooping up clods of earth with a ladle, and the ground trembled under people's feet. Rough voices, clanging metal, short smoke breaks. The factory seemed to resist, pouring dust and small debris on them, crumbling concrete. The foreman, a burly man named Richter, watched the process, silent, sullen, with a face streaked with wrinkles like a stone mask. He served on the Eastern Front and returned with the eyes of a man who had seen too much. No one argued with him. Even the most talkative workers lowered their voices in his presence. It was an overcast afternoon the day the excavator bucket hit the concrete slab. Metal grated, the engine shut down, and everyone heard a dull crack, as if a bone was breaking underground. Richter came closer and bent down. From under the layer of dust, smooth gray concrete appeared, but with a smooth geometry that did not resemble the foundation of the old workshop. There was a small crack in the center, from which came a cold, uncharacteristic musty earth. Workers surrounded the discovery site. Someone joked that they had found an air raid shelter, someone said that there was a basement with gold. Richter wasn't laughing. He ordered the site to be cleaned and brought a crowbar. The slab did not give way immediately. They beat on it, pushed metal beams, listened to the emptiness inside resound. And when the concrete finally collapsed, a cloud of dust billowed up, hiding everything around. When it dissipated, a black hole opened below, leading into the unknown. It smelled of damp, rust, and something else as old as the war itself. One of the workers said he could smell burnt wiring. Another added that he hears dripping water. Richter just stood there and watched. There was something that could hardly be called fear in his gaze. Rather, wariness is habitual, soldier-like. They brought lanterns. The rays trembled, picking out concrete walls covered with cobwebs from the darkness. There was a ladder below, rusted metal but sturdy. Someone suggested waiting for the engineers, but Richter went down first. The others followed him. The air grew thicker with every step. Moisture stood out on the walls, and pieces of wires, corroded by time, lay on the floor. A wide corridor opened below, with a low ceiling and metal doors on both sides. It was as if everything was frozen in the past, as if people had suddenly left here and never returned. The first door was locked tightly. The second one, on the contrary, succumbed after several blows with a crowbar. When it opened, the smell of burning came out of the room. The light of the lanterns picked out something massive from the darkness, a streamlined metal structure resembling the body of an airplane, but without wings and tail. She took up almost the entire room. The surface was smooth, covered with a touch of time, but without a single scratch. The metal reflected the light unnaturally, as if it absorbed it. Richter came closer and ran his hand over the paneling. I felt a chill beneath my fingers that wasn't iron. He didn't say a word, but it was clear from the way his shoulders tensed that he realized it wasn't just a technique. There were boxes in the corner of the room. One of them was ajar, and inside were bundles of yellow documents tied with ribbons. The inscription has been preserved on the lid, Geheimes Reichsprojekt. Gerät IX. Richter took out a folder and unfolded the first sheet. The German script was clear and dry, diagrams, tables, signatures, seals. In one place there was a handwritten note, leave underground until the field stabilizes. The workers exchanged glances. No one understood what kind of field they were talking about. One of them, a former mechanic, tried to inspect the cabin of the device. Inside there were instruments, dials, panels with symbols that no one could recognize. When they reached the surface, the sun was already setting. The air seemed different, as if it were denser. Richter smoked in silence for a long time, one cigarette after another. No one dared to speak first. Then he ordered not to tell anyone about the discovery until the arrival of representatives from the department. The next day, the military arrived. 3 men in gray raincoats, with short haircuts and expressionless faces. They didn't introduce themselves. They just showed me the papers and ordered me to fence off the place. The workers were sent home. They were paid in advance and told not to return. No one argued. 2 days later, the playground was surrounded by a fence, and army tents rose above it. The equipment arrived at night, without numbers, without emblems. Richter was never seen again. They said he was summoned to Leipzig for questioning, but he never returned. Rumors began to spread among the workers. Someone claimed to have seen boxes covered with tarpaulins being taken out of the dungeon. Someone swore that he had heard a humming sound at night, low, monotonous, as if from underground. But people weren't looking for explanations then. It was a difficult time, no one wanted problems. The factory was soon completely demolished. In its place was a wasteland covered with fragments of bricks. However, a few weeks later, things started to get weird in the neighborhood. Radios picked up interference, the hands of the instruments in the workshops were deflected by themselves, the lamps were flashing for no reason. Locals complained of headaches, insomnia, as if the air had become electric. The authorities waved them off, saying that the power grid was old, nothing surprising. But people knew that it started after they found that thing under the factory. There was one of the workers named Lang. Young, thin, with perpetually slumped shoulders. He couldn't get that day out of his mind. At night, he dreamed of the smooth surface of the metal hull reflecting the light of a lantern, and an empty cabin with instruments on which the hands froze. He felt that there was something inside, something incomplete. A week after everything was taken out, he returned to the place, secretly, at night. The fence was already up, but there was a gap in one place between the boards. Through it, he could see how people in uniform were still swarming underground, as cables were being pulled out of the hatch. He stood for a long time until he felt a vibration under his feet, light but palpable, as if the earth were breathing. The next morning, he tried to tell an engineer he knew about it, but the engineer waved him off. He said it seemed like the ground was sagging, so it seems. Lang fell silent, but the anxiety did not go away. He began to write down everything that was happening in the area, dates, times, strange phenomena. Radio interference, blackouts, even complaints from neighbors. More and more notes appeared in his notebook, neat and dry, like a report. Gradually, these notes turned into an obsession. He stopped working and started going to the vacant lot at night. It was said that sometimes he would sit there for hours, just listening to the silence. In the spring of 1950, a rumor spread in the city. One of the former construction workers was found dead in his apartment. They said it was the heart. But neighbors claimed that he had screamed in his sleep the night before. It was Lang. A notebook was found in his room. The police took it away, but some of the pages were missing. This was later told in the corridors of the police stations, in whispers. On the surviving pages, only one word was written, repeated dozens of times: noise. After that, no one thought about the factory anymore. The place was concreted, a sign was put up: the facility is closed. Dangerous. Do not open it. The years passed. Leipzig was recovering, the war was a thing of the past, and the memory of those events was dissolving into everyday life. But there was one common detail among the old workers who stood next to Richter at the time. When the slab collapsed before they went downstairs, one of them swore he saw a green light flash briefly under the concrete block. And even though no one believed him, each of them later admitted to himself, after that day, the silence underground was never silence anymore. Almost 6 months have passed since Lang's death. The city was gradually returning to normal life, although there was still a strange tension in the air, subtle but palpable. People tried not to talk about the factory, as if the very sound of the word was somehow contagious. By that time, the place had turned into a wasteland overgrown with weeds. It was marked on the map as an industrial zone with limited access, but no buildings were built anymore. Sometimes military trucks arrived there, quietly, at night, without headlights, and also disappeared without a trace. No one knew what they were doing, and no one wanted to know. However, the city construction department still has documents, reports on dismantling, signatures, and inventory numbers. Among them is a copy of the report on the discovery under the factory. This document was mistakenly not seized along with the others. It was gathering dust in a folder labeled Secondary Objects. And it was he who was found by the man who was soon to awaken the past. His name was Karl Müller, an archivist engineer, short, dry, with a round face and a habit of constantly adjusting his glasses. He didn't participate in the war, he was too young, but he grew up among the ruins and always felt a painful attraction to them. It seemed to him that the destroyed buildings were whispering that there was a story hidden in their empty windows that no one wanted to listen to. When he first saw the document, he didn't even realize that there was something special in front of him. Several pages with technical notes, the signature is illegible, stamped at the bottom, Geheimes Reichsprojekt. Gerät IX. But he was alerted by the date, 1944, and an indication of an underground complex under a textile factory. Müller remembered passing by this place as a child. His mother always took his hand and walked faster, as if she was afraid. He didn't think much of it then. Now the interest has woken up. He made a copy of the document and put it in his personal archive. After a few weeks, I started looking for information about Gerät IX. First in the city archives, then in the library of the Technical Institute. The result was 0. Such a designation has not been found anywhere. Neither in the lists of weapons, nor in the reports of the Allies, nor even in the references to the occult or experimental projects of the Reich that the Americans studied. All that could be found were fragmentary rumors about magnetic generators and a sphere capable of distorting space. But Müller was a rational man. He didn't believe in legends. He wanted to understand what could really be hidden under this cipher. He sent a request to the departmental archive in Dresden. The answer came a month later: there is no data on the Gerät IX project. Further inquiries on the topic should be sent through the Ministry of Defense. The response style seemed strange to him, too fast, too cautious. Usually, the bureaucracy dragged on for months, but here it was instantaneous. He realized that he had stumbled upon something that was not worth asking. But that's what made him continue. In the summer of 1951, Müller decided to visit the site for the first time. The wasteland was on the outskirts, away from the roads. The ground there was uneven, overgrown with sagebrush, and only in the center stood a concrete dome with a rusty sign, "Dangerous. Do not open it." He walked around it several times, felt the surface. The concrete was smooth and fresh, and had clearly been poured after the war. No hatches or crevices. But there was an emptiness under his feet, an echo of what lay beneath him. He stood there for over an hour, listening to the wind. As I was leaving, I noticed a thin metal pin driven into the ground at the edge of the playground. There was no marking on it. He thought it was a remnant of the old dimensions. Only later did I realize that I was wrong. In the evening of the same day, he wrote in his diary: "There's something under the factory. The air there is different. There may be an uncleaned bunker left. Check the geological map." That's how his obsession began. At first, harmless curiosity, then, anxious interest. He began collecting everything related to the factory: photographs, newspaper clippings, and testimony from former workers. He found some of them by their addresses. One, named Kramer, lived in a nearby village. The old man, stooped, with bleary eyes, did not want to speak for a long time. But when Müller showed him a copy of the document, he paled. "It's not for you, kid," he said, "we opened up something we shouldn't have touched." But he didn't explain anything else. He just added, Richter knew. He said it wasn't a car. That there was something alive inside. But I think he's lost his mind. After this meeting, Müller stopped sleeping peacefully. He dreamed of corridors underground, long, damp, stretching into darkness. He could hear a hum in them, not a sound, but a vibration, as if the air were vibrating. He woke up in a cold sweat and couldn't understand why his heart was beating as if he was running. Every day the desire to return to the place grew stronger. He felt that he had to see it with his own eyes. In the autumn of 1951, he came there again, now with a friend, a surveyor named Becker. He agreed to help measure the underground voids. They brought equipment, a primitive echo sounder, punched tapes, and a generator. We worked at night so that no one could see. The first measurements showed that there really is a cavity under the concrete, about 20 meters long and 3 meters high. But in the center of the device, the arrow twitched and froze. Becker shrugged his shoulders, probably interference. Müller did not respond. He felt the same vibration that Lang described in his notebook. A slight tremor of the earth, like breathing. They stopped working and left. But a week later, Becker had an accident. The truck flew off the road. There were no witnesses. After the funeral, Müller returned home and burned all the papers, except for one, a copy of the protocol and the measurement scheme. That night, he sat at the window for a long time, looking out at the rain. It seemed to him that the sound of raindrops coincided with the hum that he had heard then in the wasteland. Since then, he has no longer touched on this topic publicly. But every evening he opened his notebook and made short notes, restrained, without emotion, like engineering reports. October 11th. The wind increases towards night. Radio interference in the 32 kHz band. October 13th. The smell of ozone is on the street. October 15th. The ground is shaking, but only within a radius of 300 meters from the former factory. These recordings continued until the end of the year. Then suddenly they stop. No one knows what happened to Müller. In early 1952, his apartment was opened at the request of neighbors. He did not appear for several weeks. There was an open notebook on the table, and the last line read, "They're back." No papers, no documents. Everything was gone, and so was he. After that, the wasteland was forgotten again. The city was developing, new neighborhoods were being built, and only old people from the northern regions remembered that there had once been a factory there. But there was still a trace in the management. A decade later, in the mid-60s, a young officer of the Ministry of Defense named Weissman was ordered to check the condition of the old underground structures. Among the list of objects was this one: Factory Number 7, Leipzig, the facility is closed. Weissman, a meticulous man, decided to follow the order literally. He requested the old maps, found the archived coordinates and drove to the place. By that time, a small residential area had already grown up around the wasteland. People used to avoid the center of the playground. They said it smelled of metal even in the heat. Weissman ordered the site to be cleared. The same concrete dome was found under the layer of earth. Its surface was cracked but durable. The staff tried to drill it, but the drill bit melted, as if bumping into an alloy. I had to use explosives. After the first explosion, the ground under the dome subsided, and the crater revealed part of the old tunnel. What they saw resembled an abandoned technical corridor. Weissman went downstairs. The smell of rot and dust hit me in the face. Cables and rusted pipes ran along the walls. There are metal fragments on the floor, which look like parts of some kind of equipment. At the very end of the tunnel, there was a huge door pushed to the side. Behind it was a spacious room, in the center of which stood the same building. But now he was not whole. The paneling cracked, part of the panel collapsed, and tools left decades ago were scattered around. There were traces of an old campfire on the floor. Someone had warmed up here or tried to burn something. Weissman examined the object for a long time. He recorded everything in a magazine, filmed it on camera. The cabin of the device attracted special attention. The instruments had been dismantled, but some of the dials still retained traces of carbon deposits. He noted that the metal is unlike any known alloy, too light and durable. When he tried to take a sample, the knife blade left only a dark mark on the surface, like a burn. Later, he wrote in a report, "The object is a building of unknown purpose. An experimental installation of an electromagnetic type is possible." No traces of weapons were found. However, on the evening of the same day, when they were leaving the place, one of the soldiers reported that he had a severe migraine. A few hours later, 2 others complained of dizziness. Weissman decided that the cause was evaporation, but when he returned to headquarters and tried to develop the film, it turned out to be damaged. The frames were illuminated, some with only vague shadows and incomprehensible glare, as if from electrical discharges. He wrote a report, sent it upstairs, and never received a response. The project was closed. Many years have passed since then. The people who participated in the survey left, and some died. Weissman retired and settled in the suburbs. Sometimes, in rare moments of insomnia, he remembered that smell, a mixture of metal and burning. It seemed to him that he was still standing down there, among the concrete and rust, and looking at the charred hull, from which a light, almost imperceptible glow seemed to emanate. But he never talked about it. Only in his diary, many years later, did he write a phrase that his children later found: "If it was a weapon, it was aimed not at enemies, but at those who created it." It's been more than 20 years. The world has changed. Germany has long been divided into East and West, cities have been rebuilt, and the memory of the war has gradually turned into educational paragraphs and newspaper lines. In Leipzig, where that factory once stood, now stretched the outskirts of the residential areas, monotonous houses, gray, as if painted with one hand. But beyond them, beyond the last row of garages, there was still a vacant lot. That's the one. It was listed on maps as a maintenance area, but no one went there. The ground was sinking in there, and at night there seemed to be a low hum, although perhaps it was just the noise of trains from a distant depot. People are used to not asking questions. In 1978, a letter arrived at the editorial office of the local newspaper, Leipziger Tageblatt. A yellowed envelope, neat handwriting. The postmark has a city stamp, sent from the Schönfeld district. The letter was signed and dated. The author called himself Friedrich Kramer and claimed to be one of the workers involved in the dismantling of the factory in 1949. He wrote that then they found something underground that the military had taken out. But not all of it. There's something left. There was no request for publication in the letter, just an insistent statement: "You must know the truth. Not everything died under that land. Sometimes I can still hear it breathing." The newspaper editor, a practical man, wanted to throw the letter away at first. But the lines in it were written not as nonsense, but as a report. Kramer described in detail where the entrance was, what he saw inside, and even provided a rough hand-drawn diagram of the room. A couple of days later, the editor, still intrigued, showed the letter to his friend, a historian named Stolz, who was involved in military archives. He immediately became alert. He knew about such stories. In those years, secret facilities really existed under the guise of scientific laboratories. He decided to check it out. Stolz was a scrupulous man. At 48, he already had a reputation for pedantry and loneliness. He worked in the archive of the Ministry of Industry, leafing through dusty folders, looking for traces of old technologies. He wasn't interested in legends, but Kramer's letter seemed too specific to him. He contacted the editor, got the original, and began his own investigation. The first thing he did was check the name. Kramer's last name was indeed listed in the lists of workers who participated in the dismantling of the factory. The age matched. There was only one caveat: there was a note in the archive: he died in 1952. This detail changed everything. The letter could not have been written by a dead man, but the signature was real. He checked it against the documents. Stoltz tried to track down Kramer's relatives. It turned out that he had a daughter who lived in the neighboring area. She confirmed, "Yes, my father died a long time ago, from a stroke. I never wrote letters." However, a month before his death, he was strange. He said that at night he hears metal moving underground. No one took it seriously. When Stoltz showed her the letter, she turned pale. The handwriting was really his. The historian realized that the matter goes much deeper than just an urban legend. He began collecting everything related to the old factory: construction reports, military protocols, articles from the post-war reconstruction period. Almost nothing has been preserved, as if all the documents were deliberately destroyed. In one of the folders, he found only a dry entry: the facility is closed. Conservation is permanent. No control required. No signature, no date. He drove to the place. The wasteland greeted him with silence. Dry grass, potholes, concrete fragments, industrial zone pipes on the horizon. In the center is the same concrete dome, cracked and covered with moss. Stoltz walked around him, took some pictures for practice. The wind hummed through the cracks, creating a monotonous sound, as if someone was humming from inside. He went down into the hollow where the tunnel used to pass, and suddenly noticed fresh footprints on the ground, as if someone had recently dragged equipment here. There was a broken wooden drawer handle on the edge, and the barely legible letter R on the metal. When he returned home, he developed the film. In one of the pictures taken near the dome, something strange was visible: a faint halo of light, similar to a reflection, but it was not present in the neighboring frames. The film was new, the lens was working properly. He noted this in his journal: there may be a defect in the emulsion, but there was no light source in place. Nevertheless, the feeling of anxiety did not leave him. In the following days, he noticed that his tape recorder distorted the sound when he put it next to the photos. He couldn't find any logical explanations, but he tried to keep a cool head. Everything can be explained by technique, coincidence, and film noise. A week later, he went to the city archive, where the reports of the construction commissions were kept. The archivist, an elderly man, searched for the right folder for a long time, then said that it had been seized back in the early 60s, by order from above. No one knew who exactly gave the order. In the evening, tired of fruitless searches, Stoltz went into a pub. There he accidentally got into conversation with a former electrician who worked at the factory after the war. He remembered that when the dismantling was completed, the military was lowering something underground, and then for several weeks the smell of ozone and burnt oil was coming from the tunnel. Then everything was filled with concrete. They said there was some kind of engine inside that they couldn't turn off, the old man said. But I think they were just afraid to admit that they didn't understand what it was. This phrase stuck in Stoltz's head. The engine that couldn't be turned off. He wrote it down in a notebook. In the following months, he tried to find out where the seized documents had gone. The trail led him to Prague, where the German research center was located after the war. There he found a mention of a project with a similar cipher, Gerät IX, in the lists of evacuated developments. However, next to it was the word unvollständig, unfinished. The technical notes read, "The object has been partially moved. The materials are unstable. Work has been stopped." Stoltz felt the same tension arouse in him that Muller probably once felt. Everything matched: dates, places, even the names of the engineers. In 1944, one of them, named Breed, was part of a group engaged in experiments with the electromagnetic field. After the war, his trail is lost. But in private correspondence found by Stolz in the Museum of Technology, he came across a letter from Breda to a certain woman from Dresden, dated April 1945. There was a phrase, "We have taken a step over the edge. Now the Earth itself is resisting." Stolz returned home with the feeling that his mind was starting to crack from overload. He convinced himself that all these were just the traces of experiments, unsuccessful, possibly dangerous, but not mystical. However, the more he read, the more he felt uneasy inside. He was tormented by dreams about underground halls, metal walls, and sounds like humming. He woke up and couldn't separate the dream from the memory. In December 1978, he decided. "I took a flashlight, a dictaphone, an old map and went to the wasteland at night. The wind was cold and sharp. He reached the dome and stood listening. Everything seemed dead, but at some point he felt a barely noticeable tremor under his feet, a short jolt, as if a heavy car had passed underground. He crouched down and put his palm to the ground. Silence. But in the recorder, when he listened to the recording later, there was a faint low tone at this point, similar to the hum of a transformer. He listened to it over and over again until he noticed that the frequency was repeated with an exact frequency, every 38 seconds. A few days later, he wrote an article, without names, without specific locations, under a fictitious heading, "Underground Traces of War, Forgotten Objects of the Third Reich." The text was dry, but at the end he inserted the phrase, "Sometimes the past is not buried, it just waits to be rediscovered." The article was published in the January issue, the 1979 issue. A week later, the editorial office was visited by people in civilian clothes. They took the original photos, the dictaphone, and the drafts. The staff was told to keep quiet. Stolz himself was soon dismissed, for health reasons, and disappeared from view. He officially died 2 years later. But the archives have preserved the last entry in his diary, "I was there again. The dome cracked. Metal breathing can be heard from inside. It looks like the engine is still running. The year is 1997. Berlin. Archive of the Federal Intelligence Service." Jonas Kohler, a 32-year-old young analyst, has only been in the department for 3 years. Before that, he worked as a journalist, but left after a scandalous publication about corruption in the department. Now he was doing routine checks on old Cold War files, microfilms, agent lists. The job is boring, but stable. Until one evening, while looking through old file cabinets, he came across a folder with a red sticker. Leipzig, Object 9, Act geschlossen. Zugang verboten. He took it just out of curiosity. Inside there are several photographs that have faded from time to time, a dome in the middle of a vacant lot, concrete with cracks, next to a man in a raincoat, caption under the picture, Dr. H. Stolz, 1978. Jonas flipped through more, printouts of radio interference, reports of unidentified low-frequency vibrations in the area of the former factory. On the last page there is a typewritten note. The object is of no strategic value. Deactivation is not possible. Visual inspection every 10 years. The words, "deactivation is not possible," got him hooked. He couldn't understand what was being said. What does an object that cannot be deactivated mean? The engine? A car? The project? Or something else? Kohler started looking for mentions of the same code number, Object 9, in the database. The system returned only 3 matches. The first is a 1945 document with the stamp SS Forschung. The second is the report of the Ministry of Reconstruction from 1949. And the third is a letter without an addressee, signed F. Kramer. The letter said, "We found what they left. It wasn't supposed to work, but it's still alive." Jonas felt a strange excitement. The story looked like a ready-made plot, what the journalist was always looking for in it. He copied the documents onto a USB flash drive, although it was forbidden, and in the evening he began to sort out the materials at home. The more he read, the more he felt that all this was being deliberately hidden, not because of secrecy, but because of fear. The fear is not that it is a weapon, but that no one understood what it was at all. The next day he went to Leipzig. The wasteland still existed. Now there's an industrial zone, warehouses, and a car repair shop all around. In place of the dome is a low hill overgrown with bushes. But if you listened closely, you could hear a slight hum, as if a generator was working somewhere in the depths. Jonas went down into the hollow and noticed the remains of a concrete base, with rusty fragments of reinforcement sticking out in some places. I took some photos and made notes. An elderly car attendant, noticing him, came up and said, "You shouldn't have gone in there. People were disappearing there." "Have you been missing?" Jonas asked. "Yes. 10 years ago, 2 boys went there and found a trapdoor. One returned, the other was never found. Then everything was covered up with earth." Jonas thanked him, but inwardly brushed it off, rumors, as always. However, when he returned to the hotel in the evening, he noticed that his hands were shaking. It was strange, not from fear, but from some vague tension, as if he felt that he was standing on the edge of something that he could not comprehend. When he returned to Berlin, he tried to find the descendants of Stolz, the same historian from the photograph. The archives stated that he had no family, but had a student, Karl Neumann, now a professor of the history of technology in Hamburg. Jonas contacted him. The meeting took place a week later. The old professor turned out to be dry and restrained, but when he heard the words, Object 9, he fell silent. Then he said softly, "Did you find this file? Then listen up. Just once." He said that Stolz was obsessed with this object. That in the last months before his disappearance, he talked about the human factor, that the engine is not a machine, but a system of people. That Reich's experiments allegedly included not technology, but psychology, the study of how collective consciousness can be connected with energy, with the behavior of the mass. He believed that the Germans were trying to build a device capable of stabilizing emotions, the professor continued. Create a machine that affects not physics, but the psyche. Control fear, rage, and will. But something went wrong. After the war, the military tried to dismantle the installations, but some parts had already worked, on a human level, in the minds of those who came into contact with them. They were going crazy. Jonas asked. And technically? What was there? No one knows. The reports talked about ring structures, magnetic coils, but it could have been metaphorical language. Perhaps it was just an experiment to isolate people in extreme conditions. But after that, not a single participant lived more than a year. Why wasn't the place destroyed? The professor chuckled. And you try to destroy what is already in your heads. Jonas drove home with a heavy heart. Everything he had heard seemed crazy, and yet too consistent to be just a legend. He decided to return to Leipzig once more, but this time officially, with permission for a field check of archive data. They signed the permit for him without reading it carefully. There are hundreds of such papers. The night before he left, he did not sleep. I was listening to an old audio tape found in a folder. There is a hum in it, rhythmic, with breaks after exactly 38 seconds. At the 48th minute, a quiet male voice was heard, "It can still hear us." He rewound, listened again. This time, there was something different in the voice, a barely discernible fear, as if the person was speaking not into a microphone, but to himself. Leipzig, May 1997. Jonas arrived at the vacant lot at dusk. He has a ground-penetrating radar, a camera and a voice recorder with him. He turned on the recording, pointed the antenna at the ground. After a few minutes, the screen revealed the contours. There was a cavity about 20 meters in diameter under the surface. There is a dense metal object in the center. In the report, he noted, underground room, level -6m. The structure is hollow. The acoustic resonance is stable. He tried to find the entrance. A couple of hours later, I came across a broken metal hatch, partially covered with earth. He pushed the stove away with difficulty. Below it is a narrow passage leading down. The air is heavy, it smells of oil and rust. Jonas switched on the flashlight and carefully descended. The steps are slippery, the metal trembles underfoot. There is a corridor below, the walls are made of steel, covered with a strange coating. There is an empty cable reel on the floor, next to it is a faded chalk inscription, Stolz 78. He walked on. The room turned out to be circular, with a huge metal ring in the middle. There was a void in the center, but cables ran from the walls to the ring, all rusted, as if frozen in time. Jonas took out a dictaphone. Recording. Object 9. The underground level. The ring structure is visible. No sign of any mechanism. Maybe it's part of an old turbine. He took a step forward. A rumble echoed underfoot, as if an old transformer had gone off somewhere. He froze. In the silence, the sound was repeated, exactly 38 seconds later. Jonas turned off the recording and stood motionless. The sound wasn't loud, but it made me shiver. He felt, from somewhere inside, from his chest to his temples, not fear, but a strange feeling, as if someone was very close, behind his back, just breathing to the beat of this sound. He whirled around. Empty. Just the hallway and the faint glow of a lantern. He hurriedly climbed out, closed the hatch, made a mark on the map and left. 2 days later, I submitted a report to my superiors. The wording was neutral, traces of an industrial structure from the time of the war. It poses no danger. But at night, when he went to bed, the hum returned. At first, it was as quiet as a pulse, then smoother, more regular. Every 38 seconds. He timed it. It matched. Jonas tried to distract himself by turning on the music, but the hum remained. Not in my ears, not in the walls, but somewhere deeper. Inside. A week later, he wrote in his notebook. I think I understood what Stolz meant when he wrote about the engine that cannot be turned off. He doesn't work in metal. He works in us. A month later, Jonas quit. Disappeared. There is a dry record in the BND reports. Employee Kohler J. is missing. Last location, Leipzig, industrial area. The materials have been seized. The case is closed. A logistics center was soon built on the site of the wasteland. The ground was leveled, concreted, and guarded. Sometimes at night, local workers complained that a low rumble could be heard somewhere under the floor, as if an old generator was working deep below. They were told it was just ventilation. More than 50 years have passed since the builders first found a concrete slab hiding a strange metal object. The factory's territory was destroyed and rebuilt, the wasteland was overgrown, but there was still a system underground left over from the previous project. At first it seemed like just a reminder of the past, but those who tried to find out the truth felt the pressure mounting. Archival documents showed that Project 9 had never been completed, that no one fully understood its principles, and that any interference with the system led to unpredictable consequences. The testimony of the engineers who wrote the reports pointed to an experiment in which people became not just observers, but part of a mechanism that controlled their own reactions, emotions, and behavior. During the experiment, a constant rhythm was created, low-frequency impulses synchronized with the nervous system of the participants, which caused a gradual loss of individual initiative and increased subordination. The project was frozen, but the residual effects persisted in the psyche of people nearby, and sometimes manifested themselves decades later in the form of anxiety, obsessive sensations, and incomprehensible physiological reactions. Archival documents showed that the military, while evacuating the facility, could not completely dismantle the system, and some of its elements were embedded in the structure of buildings and underground utilities, maintaining a weak but tangible impact on the surrounding space. Everyone who examined the materials noted the appearance of the same sensations, rhythmic tension and strange discomfort that could not be explained by technique or rumors. People noticed that time and space began to obey a hidden rhythm, which was repeated at regular intervals and remained in memory as an obsessive sequence acting on the subconscious. With each new generation of those who came into contact with the archives, the feeling of impact intensified, and the history of IX became less and less documented, turning into a chain of subjective memories, recordings and photographs. The object was never a weapon in the traditional sense, but it demonstrated the ability to influence the collective consciousness, suppress the will and synchronize people's emotions, turning them into elements of a mechanism that continued to function even after the physical installation stopped. Underground rooms in Leipzig, Prague, and other parts of Europe were carefully camouflaged, concreted, and sealed off, but residual fields and psychological effects remained, transmitted through contact with the object, through reading documents, or even through the memories of those who saw the device. Studies have shown that prolonged exposure to an object caused mild dizziness, a feeling of internal pressure, and obsessive cycles of thoughts that were repeated at regular intervals, beyond control. With each new discovery, the same pattern remained: the more a person tried to understand the device, the more it affected his psyche, turning interest and curiosity into tension, anxiety and unconscious obedience to the rhythm laid down by the creators. All the documents and studies that were preserved indicated that System 9 was an experiment in controlling the human psyche, a tool that was not physically destroyed, but which continued to influence those who came into contact with it. Even decades later, when buildings were rebuilt, streets changed, and people changed, the remnants of the system continued to operate. Archival records recorded repetitive intervals, rhythmic breathing of air in underground rooms, and weak magnetic fluctuations. The researchers noted that these effects cannot be fully measured, that they manifest themselves only through human perception, interaction with documents, or presence in rooms associated with the facility. The story of IX did not end physically; it was preserved in consciousness, in memory, in documents, and in underground structures, leaving the impression of an invisible presence that cannot be removed. People who tried to reconstruct events recorded their feelings and experiences, described internal tension, a rhythm that could not be stopped, and a repetition of sensations similar to those experienced by the first builders, engineers, and researchers. New buildings, warehouses, and offices stood on the site of the former factory and research centers. But tunnels, concrete structures, and metal remnants remained below the surface, which preserved the residual energy of the project, a sense of cyclical work, and psychological pressure. Residents of the areas where these facilities were located sometimes heard a slight buzzing, felt discomfort, and could not understand where it was coming from. Technical explanations have never satisfied everyone, and attempts to document the history of the project have led to the repetition of the same feelings and tensions among new researchers. Project 9 was never completed in the full sense of the word, but its impact persisted and continued to exist in a hidden form, as a trace left over from the experiment on consciousness. The story, which began with the destroyed factory in Leipzig, passed through military archives, scientific centers and decades of observations, and ended without an obvious denouement, leaving only a record in documents, evidence of sensations and a hidden force that continued to affect space and people, leaving a feeling of anxiety and tension that could not be fully understood or eliminated. Thus, Object 9 was not a weapon in the usual sense; it became a tool of memory that remained in the psyche of people, documents and underground structures. Its influence lasted forever, unnoticeable and at the same time tangible, demonstrating that the most dangerous mechanisms can exist in the human head and in his perception of time and space.